Have you ever felt that pit in your stomach when memories from decades ago suddenly feel like they happened yesterday? My name is Margaret Wilson. I'm 64 years old, and what I'm about to share has been my silent burden for 50 years. That mixture of confusion and shame that makes your heart race and steals your breath. That's exactly how I felt when the priest's hands touched me inside that confessional booth. No one understands what happens inside a young girl's heart when someone who represents God Himself becomes the source of your deepest confusion. The painful truth is that some wounds never fully heal. They just form a thin scar over a wound that still aches. And that's how it all began. The story that would permanently alter the course of my life. I was barely 14 years old when it happened. Inside St. Anthony's Church, where generations of my family had worshipped, in the darkness of the confessional, where no one could witness what was happening. Father James was beloved by everyone, a pillar of our community, trusted without question. I kept what happened locked away for 5 decades. My late husband went to his grave, never knowing this secret. But before I tell you what actually occurred that Wednesday afternoon, you need to understand who I was then. Because even now, after all these years of reflection, I still question whether what happened was healing or violation. It was 1975, in Millfield, Ohio, coal country. One of those small American towns where church bells structured the rhythm of life and everyone's business was common knowledge by sundown. Main Street had Donnelly's drugstore, where the high school kids gathered after school, the First National Bank where my father would tip his hat to Mr. E., Grayson the manager, and 3 different churches competing for souls every Sunday morning. Our house sat 2 miles outside town, a modest 2-bedroom with aluminum siding that my father had installed himself, saving pennies for months to afford the materials. The kitchen had yellow linoleum flooring that my mother mopped every morning, no matter how tired she was from her night shift at the hospital. We didn't have central heating, just a wood stove in the living room that my father would stoke before dawn. On winter mornings, I'd see my breath inside my bedroom until the house slowly warmed up. We were working poor, as they called it. My father, William, worked in the coal mine, the same one that eventually took his life 20 years later from black lung disease. He was a stern, quiet man with perpetually coal-stained fingernails that never quite came clean. No matter how hard he scrubbed with that orange pumice soap, the black dust remained embedded in the creases of his hands. He believed discipline was love, and a raised voice was better than a raised hand, though sometimes we got both. My mother, Eleanor, was a nurse's aide. She wore her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her hands red and raw from constant washing and disinfecting. She could recite every Bible verse about women's obedience and believed them without question. In our house, what the pastor said was law, what her husband decided was final, and what the neighbors might think determined almost everything else. I was the middle child of 5, 3 brothers and 1 sister squeezed into 2 small bedrooms. Unlike today's kids with their private spaces and personal devices, we shared everything. Clothes were passed down until they fell apart. Toys were community property. Even the bathroom was a shared resource carefully timed and rationed during morning rush. Religion wasn't just part of our lives, it was the framework that held everything together. Sunday morning service at St. Anthony's Catholic Church was non-negotiable. Wednesday night Bible study, Friday confession, daily prayers before every meal and before bed. We were Catholic down to our bones, and the fear of God was drilled into us alongside our ABCs. Hellfire wasn't an abstract concept. It was a place as real as Cleveland, and considerably easier to find your way to. Talking about bodies, strictly forbidden. My mother would say, "Good girls don't discuss such matters." When I got my first period at 12, my mother handed me a box of sanitary pads and said only, "This is Eve's burden for her sin." No other explanation. No discussion of what was happening to my body or why. When I asked questions, I was told that curiosity about such things is the devil finding a foothold. I made my first communion at 7 years old. I still remember my white dress with the lace collar that my mother had saved up for, buying it secondhand from Mrs. Peterson, whose daughter had outgrown it. I felt pure, angelic, special. When the communion wafer touched my tongue for the first time, I was certain I could feel God Himself entering my body. From that moment, I dreamed of becoming a nun. It seemed like the highest calling a girl like me could aspire to. By 14, I was the definition of innocence. I'd never been kissed, never held a boy's hand, never even allowed myself to linger on such thoughts. I wore skirts that covered my knees, blouses buttoned to the neck, my brown hair always tied back with a simple ribbon. No makeup, no jewelry, except the small gold cross my grandmother had given me for my confirmation. I truly didn't understand how babies were made. That's how sheltered I was. I swear on the Bible, I thought married people prayed together and God put babies in women's stomachs. That's when my body started changing, and it terrified me. I developed earlier than other girls my age. By 13, I had curves that made me hunch my shoulders forward, trying to hide what was happening. I wore oversized sweaters even in warm weather and kept my arms crossed over my chest whenever possible. When my breasts started developing, I bound them with ace bandages I'd stolen from my mother's nursing supplies. I'd wrapped them so tight I could barely breathe, but it was better than facing the changes happening without my permission. I hated my body for betraying me this way, for drawing attention I didn't want or understand. The worst part was the thoughts that started coming. I began noticing Michael, the boy who sat 2 rows ahead in math class, with his dark curls and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. When he asked to borrow my pencil one day and his fingers brushed against mine, my heart raced and I felt a strange fluttering sensation in my stomach. Later, I prayed for hours, begging God to remove these impure thoughts. I was convinced I was headed straight for eternal damnation. I prayed every single day asking God to take these feelings away. In my understanding, these thoughts were mortal sins. Father Dennis, the elderly priest who had been at St. Anthony's before Father James arrived, had preached many sermons about the dangers of lust and impure thoughts. "The mind is the devil's playground," he would say, his rheumy eyes scanning the congregation. And I believed every word. The guilt consumed me. It was a weight so heavy that I couldn't sleep at night. I would pinch myself hard when inappropriate thoughts came, leaving little bruises on my arms that I hid under long sleeves. I was absolutely certain I was going to hell. There was no doubt in my mind. That's why, on that Wednesday, I went to confession. I couldn't bear carrying this weight alone anymore. I needed someone to tell me how to get rid of what I believed was evil inside me. If only I had known what would happen. It's important that you understand what that time and place was like. It wasn't like today, where children learn about their bodies in school, where information is everywhere, where questioning authority is encouraged. It was a different world entirely, a world where the priest's word was unquestionable, where doubting the church was considered a sin itself, where the fear of hell guided our every action, and where a girl like me, uninformed, guilt-ridden, desperate for approval, was the perfect target. We lived in a bubble, isolated from much of the outside world. Television was limited to what my parents approved. We had one rotary phone in the hallway where private conversations were impossible, and many adults in our community had never traveled more than 50 miles from where they were born. What we knew was what we were told. And who told us? The church. Parents. People who themselves didn't know much more than what they'd been taught. It was in this world, with this mindset, that I lived through that day. The day everything changed. The day that left me with a question that has haunted me for 50 years. What really happened in that confessional? In 1974, a year before that day that changed my life, a new priest arrived at St. Anthony's, Father James Reynolds. He was young, only 32 years old, quite different from Father Dennis, who had been elderly and stern. Father James was tall with sandy blonde hair and striking blue eyes, with a gentle way of speaking that won everyone over. He had come from a prestigious seminary in Boston and was said to be highly educated. To us, he seemed like an angel sent from heaven itself. I'm not exaggerating when I say that all the women in town seemed to stand a little straighter when he walked by, and the girls in my class would blush and giggle whenever he spoke to them directly. From the moment he arrived, church attendance swelled. His sermons were different, passionate and engaging rather than the dry, monotonous homilies we were used to. People would weep openly, kneel spontaneously, beat their chests in repentance. It was as if he had some special connection to the divine that the rest of us lacked. Once a week, he visited the sick in our community. He would go from house to house, bringing comfort and sometimes even financial help to those most in need. Everyone said that Father James is a true man of God. My mother became one of his most devoted followers. She never missed a service, a novena, or an opportunity to volunteer for church cleaning. And she dragged me along, of course. "Margaret, you need to learn to be a good Catholic woman," she would say. I went without argument, obedient as I'd been raised to be. Father James had a reputation for healing. Many people in town claimed they had been cured through his prayers. Mrs. Sullivan, who had been using a walker for her arthritis, was suddenly able to move around with just a cane after Father James prayed over her. Mr. Abernathy, who had lost most of his crops the year before to blight, reported a record harvest after receiving the priest's blessing. Stories like these spread quickly. Mothers lined up after Sunday Mass to have him bless their sick children, their struggling businesses, their troubled marriages. He was especially good with young people. He created a youth group at the church, organized retreats and summer camps. Everyone wanted to join. He said he had a special calling to guide young people on God's path. Confessions with him were different too. While Father Dennis had been quick and distant, reciting standard penances without much personal attention, Father James took his time with each person. Confessions with him often lasted much longer. He asked questions that no one had ever asked before. I remember the first time I went to confession with him. My hands were trembling, slick with nervous sweat. He asked about my family, my schoolwork, my friends. He asked if I ever had troubling thoughts. I said no, lying, of course. I was terrified to tell him about Michael, about how my heart raced when he walked by. That day, he only gave me a few Hail Marys as penance and said, "Come back whenever you need to, Margaret. God's arms are always open." But as time passed, those thoughts I tried so hard to suppress only grew stronger. I began dreaming about Michael. Innocent dreams where we just held hands or danced like at the church socials. But to me, this was the end of the world. The guilt consumed me. I couldn't pray properly, couldn't concentrate in school. I started having back pain from all the tension I was carrying. My mother noticed I was acting strangely. "What's wrong with you, girl? Are you sick?" I told her it was nothing. How could I possibly tell her what was going on in my mind? She would tell me I was possessed by the devil, so I kept it all inside, letting it fester. The back pain got worse. I walked hunched over as if carrying an invisible burden. My mother began to believe I had fallen spine. Do you know what that is? It's an old folk diagnosis where they believed the spine literally fell out of alignment, causing pain and fatigue. She took me to see Mrs. Granger, an old woman who practiced folk healing. She pulled my arms, measured things with string, but nothing helped. The pain remained. Around this same time, something happened that increased my guilt tenfold. Michael, that boy I couldn't get out of my head, approached me after school one Friday afternoon. I was walking home alone, which was rare since I usually walked with my younger sister. He caught up to me near the Thompsons' orchard, where the apple trees provided some privacy from the main road. "Hey, Margaret," he said, falling into step beside me. My heart immediately began racing, and I clutched my school books tighter to my chest. "Hello," I managed to reply, staring straight ahead. "So," he said, kicking at a stone on the path, "the spring dance is coming up next month. I was wondering if maybe you'd want to go with me." My heart nearly exploded. A strange warmth spread throughout my body, and my knees felt suddenly weak. This was exactly what I'd been dreaming about, and exactly what I'd been praying against. I couldn't even form words. I just shook my head violently and took off running toward home, leaving him standing there confused and probably embarrassed. I ran until my lungs burned, and when I finally reached home, I locked myself in the bathroom and sobbed silently so no one would hear. That night, I had a dream. I dreamed I was at the spring dance with Michael, that he held my hand, that we swayed together to Bye Bye Love by the Everly Brothers, that the church deemed acceptable for youth dances. I woke up in the middle of the night, terrified, feeling as though I'd committed a terrible sin just by dreaming. I prayed until dawn, begging God for forgiveness. 3 nights without proper sleep, the guilt eating me alive from the inside out, the back pain worsening with each day, and a voice in my head saying I needed to confess, needed to be forgiven, couldn't continue living like this. That's when I decided I would go to confession on the following Wednesday. Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent. It seemed like the perfect time to seek forgiveness for my sins. I lied to my mother, told her I was staying after school for a study group. Instead, I went alone to the church. I had no idea what was coming, no idea that Wednesday would change everything, that after that day, I would never be the same again. When I think about that day now, I still get that fluttering sensation in my stomach, that feeling that something significant is about to happen, but you don't know if it will be good or bad. And this is after 50 years have passed. The saddest part is that it wasn't just what happened that day. The warning signs had been there all along, right in front of me. The way Father James looked at certain girls, how he insisted I become more involved in church activities, how he always found a reason to touch my shoulder, to stand just a little too close. But I didn't notice any of this. Or maybe I didn't want to notice. When you're raised to obey without question, to believe that authority figures always have your best interest at heart, you become blind to certain dangers. You don't recognize the warning signs. And that was me. I was completely unprepared for what happened in that confessional booth. It was Ash Wednesday, March 1975. I'll never forget that date. A light rain was falling, not hard enough for an umbrella, but enough to leave you damp if you stayed outside too long. The sky was a solid gray, making mid-afternoon feel like early evening. I left home after lunch, using my study group excuse. My mother was distracted, folding laundry while watching Days of Our Lives on our small black and white TV, and barely looked up when I headed out the door. I walked slowly to the church, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were ice cold despite the mild weather. The pain in my back seemed worse than ever, a constant dull ache that made me walk slightly hunched over. I needed to confess. The guilt was literally killing me. 3 nights with barely any sleep, thinking about that dream, about the spring dance invitation I'd so rudely refused, about how I'd left Michael standing there confused on the dirt path. St. Anthony's was nearly empty. Being a weekday afternoon, most people were at work or school. There was only Mrs. Fitzgerald lighting candles near the statue of Mary, and Tom the caretaker sweeping the vestibule. The silence was so complete, I could hear the soft tap of my saddle shoes on the marble floor as I entered. The moment I stepped inside, I was enveloped by that familiar church smell. Incense and candle wax, old hymnals and wood polish, the faint mustiness that seems to cling to all old buildings. It's a scent that, to this day, immediately takes me back to that afternoon. I dipped my fingers in the holy water font, crossing myself as I'd done thousands of times before. The water was cool, a drop ran down my wrist and disappeared under the sleeve of my blue cardigan, my best one, without any holes or worn patches. I walked toward the confessional, which stood along the right wall of the church. It was an imposing piece of furniture, dark oak with intricate carvings of grapes and wheat symbolizing the Eucharist. Heavy burgundy curtains separated the priest's compartment from the 2 smaller spaces where penitents would kneel. Between them was a wooden screen with a small grill, allowing voices to pass through while maintaining anonymity. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the curtain. I could still turn back, go home, pretend I'd been at study group, but the guilt weighed too heavily. What if I died in my sleep that night? I'd go straight to hell with my unconfessed sin. No, I had to do this. I slipped into the confessional booth and knelt on the padded kneeler, which was worn thin from generations of penitence. It was hard and uncomfortable beneath my knees. I closed my eyes, trying to organize my thoughts, deciding how I would confess my terrible sin to Father James. I heard footsteps on the other side and the swish of the curtain being drawn. My heart rate doubled instantly. I knew it was Father James. It could only be him. He was the one who heard confessions on Wednesdays. "The Lord be with you," his voice came through the screen. I couldn't see his face clearly, just a shadowy silhouette behind the grill. "And with your spirit," I replied automatically, my voice trembling slightly. "You may begin your confession, my child," he said in that gentle, reassuring tone that had earned him the trust of the entire parish. I took a deep breath and began, already feeling tears welling up. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 2 weeks since my last confession, and I have committed a grave sin." "Tell me, child," he encouraged when I paused. "I've had impure thoughts about a boy," I confessed, my voice so quiet I wasn't sure he'd heard me. There was a silence, and then he asked in a more serious tone, "What kind of thoughts?" "I wanted to hold his hand, Father," I admitted, feeling as though I were confessing to murder, my face burning with shame. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. After what seemed like an eternity, he asked, "And did you feel anything physical when you had these thoughts?" The question surprised me. No priest had ever asked anything like that before. "Yes, Father. My heart beat fast, and my knees felt weak," I confessed, even more embarrassed now. More silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to fill the confessional and press down on me. I thought he must be horrified, that he was going to give me some terrible penance, tell me I was on the path to damnation. Then, finally, he spoke, but his words caught me completely off guard. "Come out of the confessional," he said, in a tone I couldn't quite interpret. "Excuse me, Father?" I stammered, confused. "Step out. I need to speak with you," he repeated, and I heard the curtain on his side being drawn back. My legs were shaking as I stood up. What was happening? Why did he want to talk outside the confessional? Was my sin so terrible that it required some special intervention? A mixture of fear and confusion overwhelmed me. I stepped out of the booth, smoothing down my pleated skirt nervously, adjusting my cardigan, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. Mrs. Fitzgerald was still at the front of the church. Tom had disappeared somewhere. We were practically alone in the vast space. Father James emerged from his side of the confessional. He was wearing his black cassock with the white clerical collar that stood out starkly against the dark fabric. He smiled at me, a smile that should have been comforting, but somehow made me even more nervous. "Come with me, Margaret," he said, walking toward the side door that led to the sacristy. I glanced around uncertainly. Mrs. Fitzgerald remained absorbed in her devotions, oblivious to us. No one else was in sight. I followed the priest, obedient as always, as I'd been taught to be. After all, he represented God. Who was I to question? He opened the sacristy door and gestured for me to enter. "Come in here, my child. We need to talk privately," he said, his voice still carrying that gentle quality that had made him so beloved in our community. I entered, feeling a shiver run up my spine despite the warmth of the day. I'd never been in the sacristy before. It was off limits to lay people, especially girls. But if the priest was inviting me in, it must be okay, right? He closed the door behind us. The click of the latch echoed in the silence of the room. And it was at that moment that I felt, for the first time in my young life, what true fear was. You know, as I'm telling this part of my story, I'm thinking about you listening right now. Maybe you're carrying a burden that no one sees, a pain you keep to yourself. Sometimes we feel so alone in our struggles, don't we? I'd really love to know what you're feeling. If you'd like to share, leave in the comments. I understand this pain because I've experienced. It doesn't have to be much, just a word or two. Your comment might be the embrace someone else needs right now. There are so many people watching in silence, thinking they're the only ones suffering this way. When you share even a small piece of your story, you show others they're not alone. It's like extending your hand to someone in the dark. And as I continue my story, know that I'm here, listening to you with an open heart. The closed door, the silence of the sacristy, the priest standing before me. In that instant, everything changed. I was no longer just an obedient girl confessing an innocent sin. It was something much bigger, much more frightening, and I had no idea what was coming next. My legs were trembling so badly I thought I might collapse. My palms were sweating. And the pain in my back, that pain that had been my constant companion for months, seemed to scream inside me. What happened next in that sacristy changed my life forever. And to this day, 50 years later, I still don't know if it was a blessing or a curse, if I was healed or violated. The sacristy was a small room, filled with the strong scent of beeswax candles and sacramental wine. There were vestments hanging on a wooden rack, those colorful robes priests wear for different church seasons and occasions. On a side table sat a golden chalice and a container of communion hosts. On the main wall, a crucifix hung with Jesus looking down with sorrowful eyes, as if he knew what was about to happen. The light was dim, yellowish, coming from a single bulb in a stained glass fixture overhead. Father James motioned toward a wooden bench in the corner. "Sit down, Margaret," he said. I obeyed without a word. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. He pulled up a chair and sat directly across from me, so close that our knees were almost touching. I could smell his aftershave, something with sandalwood and a hint of cinnamon. "Margaret, what you're feeling is not a sin," he said, looking directly into my eyes. I was so surprised I must have gasped. What do you mean, Father?" I stammered. "It's your body awakening. God made you this way," he continued in that calm, authoritative voice. "It's natural that you would have these feelings. It's not a sin to notice boys, to want closeness, to feel your heart quicken." "But my mother said," I began, thoroughly confused by this unexpected response. He cut me off. "Your mother is mistaken. Many adults don't understand how God created us. They fear the body and its natural responses." This was so different from everything I'd been taught my whole life that I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt a wave of relief, so I wasn't a terrible sinner headed for damnation. But another part was suspicious. If these feelings weren't sinful, why had I been told my entire life that they were? "But there's something more serious happening with you," he said, his tone shifting to something more grave. "What is it?" I asked, the fear returning. That's when he closed his eyes and began murmuring something in Latin. I didn't understand the words, but I recognized it as the ancient language of church prayers. After several moments like this, he opened his eyes and said, "During your confession, God revealed something about you to me." My heart raced faster. What could it be? What had God told the priest about me? "You're in pain, aren't you?" he asked. That question hit me like a thunderbolt. I actually was in pain, had been for months, the persistent ache in my back that made me walk hunched over, that woke me at night, that had become my constant companion. Pain I had never told anyone about, not even my mother. I thought it was my own weakness or punishment for my impure thoughts. I suffered in silence, as I'd been taught good girls should do with all discomfort. "How do you know that?" I asked, unable to hide my astonishment. He smiled, a smile that seemed to mix satisfaction and compassion. God shows me the suffering of his children when I can help them. I sat in stunned silence, processing this revelation. How could he possibly know about my back pain? Was it truly a divine message? In those days, I believed wholeheartedly in miracles, visions, messages from God. Everyone in town did. There were all those stories about miraculous healings performed by Father James. Could this be real? I'm going to pray over you. I'll lay hands on you, as Jesus did with the sick, he said, standing up from his chair. What do you mean? I asked, not understanding what he intended to do. Close your eyes and trust in God, he replied, already moving to stand behind me. I closed my eyes obediently, and then I felt his hands touch my head. They were large hands, warm. He began praying in Latin, his deep, solemn voice filling the small room. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. His hands moved from my head to my shoulders. The prayer continued without interruption. My entire body was trembling, from fear, from nervousness, from something else I couldn't name. Then his hands moved to my back. He pressed exactly where the pain was worst. It was a strange sensation, first a sharp jab of pain, then a spreading warmth, as if the heat from his hands was melting something hard inside me. "Come out, spirit of infirmity, be gone," he commanded, pressing harder. I nearly fell off the bench, and he had to steady me. That's when I started crying. I didn't understand what was happening. It was a mixture of fear, relief, and utter confusion. His hands continued moving down my back, reaching the lower region where the pain was most intense. I could feel the warmth of his hands through my thin blouse. My entire body tingled with goosebumps. And then I felt something I had never experienced before. A kind of heat in my lower abdomen, a tingling sensation that spread throughout my body. It was both pleasant and terrifying at the same time. I had no idea what was happening to me. I didn't know if this was spiritual healing, if it was the devil tempting me, or if it was something natural about my own body that I'd never been taught. I was 14 years old, and no one had ever explained anything to me about how bodies work, how we respond to touch, about desires or sensations. To me, anything related to the body was sinful, and that was the end of the discussion. His hands moved lower, almost reaching I can't even say it. But he stopped. Or I think he stopped. It's hard to remember exactly. Everything happened so quickly, or was it agonizingly slow? I can't tell you how long it lasted. 5 minutes? 20? Time seemed to lose all meaning in that sacristy. "It is done. God has healed you," he finally said, abruptly releasing me. I opened my eyes, feeling dizzy, as if waking from a dream. He had turned his back to me and was arranging something on the table. Did he seem out of breath? Or was that just my imagination? I can't say for sure. Memory plays tricks sometimes, especially after so many years. "You may go now, my child," he said without turning around. "Your pain will subside. God has answered your prayers." I rose from the bench, my legs wobbling beneath me. I felt strange, like I wasn't fully in my body, like something significant had happened, but I couldn't quite grasp what it was. I walked to the door, each step feeling like I was learning to walk all over again. I left the sacristy without looking back. I practically ran through the church. Mrs. Fitzgerald was gone. There was no one there anymore. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the rain, which was falling harder now. I let the water soak my face, mixing with tears I hadn't even realized were flowing. I glanced back one last time and thought I saw Father James watching me through the sacristy window. Or did I imagine that too? I'll never know. I ran home, soaked to the skin, shivering. My mother was in the kitchen starting dinner preparations when I arrived. "Where have you been? You're soaking wet," she scolded. "Study group ran late," I lied, the first of many lies that would follow in the years to come. "Go change before you catch pneumonia," she ordered, not noticing anything unusual about me, or pretending not to notice. That night, lying on my bed that I shared with my younger sister, I couldn't sleep. I kept reliving every moment in the sacristy. The priest's hands on my back, the warmth I had felt, the tingling, the strange sensations, the pain that, strangely enough, had indeed subsided considerably. It was then that I began living a double life. On the outside, I was still the same obedient, quiet girl who went to church, helped her mother, lowered her eyes when boys passed by. But inside, I was a whirlwind of questions, doubts, sensations, and fears. The real question, one that has followed me to this day, is, what actually happened there? Was I healed through a miracle, as so many others in town claimed to have been? Or was I the victim of something more sinister, disguised as a blessing? Was the priest truly praying for me, or was he using his authority for something else entirely? And those sensations I felt, were they the manifestation of divine power, or the awakening of my own body, triggered by hands that shouldn't have touched me? That way. In the days that followed, my back pain did diminish significantly. Within a few weeks, it had disappeared completely. Was it a miracle? Or did my body simply respond to touch, to human warmth, to the momentary release of the tension I had been carrying? The weeks after that day in the sacristy passed like a strange dream. I went through the motions of daily life, waking up, helping around the house, going to school, coming home, doing chores. But inside, I was completely divided. It was as if there were two Margarets, the one from before that day and the one after. The back pain had disappeared completely. That much was undeniable. I could bend to pick up laundry from the basket without wincing. I could carry my books home from school without stopping every block to rest. It was like a weight had been lifted from me, at least physically. But the weight on my conscience only grew heavier. I couldn't look at my mother without feeling guilty, as if I had done something terrible. On the rare occasions I went to church, only when absolutely forced, I kept my head down the entire time, terrified of meeting Father James's eyes. When he approached to give communion, my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the host several times. The worst was at night, trying to sleep. The scenes would replay with vivid clarity, his hands on my back, the warmth I felt, the confusing and troubling sensations. I would toss and turn, restless, sometimes waking up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. My sister would complain, "What's wrong with you, Maggie? Stop moving around." But I couldn't tell anyone. Who could I possibly talk to? My mother? She would say I was making it up, or worse, that I was possessed by impure spirits. My sister? She was younger, she wouldn't understand. My father? He would probably belt me just for bringing up the subject. Friends? I didn't have any I trusted enough. And even if I did, how could I explain something I didn't understand myself? It was in the midst of this confusion that a month after that day, something happened that changed everything again. It was a Sunday after Mass. I had gone only because my mother practically dragged me there. I stayed in the back pew, hiding behind a column, praying for the service to end quickly, and for Father James not to notice me. When Mass finished, I bolted out before the final blessing. I waited for my family outside, near the large oak tree in the churchyard. My mother took longer than usual. She always stayed to chat with the other women from the parish, exchanging recipes, gossiping about who was getting married, who was expecting, the usual small-town talk. When she finally appeared, she had a strange expression on her face, a mixture of pride and concern. "Margaret," she said, taking my hand, "Father James wants to speak with you. He said God revealed to him that you have a special calling." I felt my blood turn to ice. "What kind of calling?" I managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. "A calling to serve the church," she replied, squeezing my hand. "He wants you to join the youth group that helps with catechism. He says you have a gift for teaching the little ones." "I don't want to," I blurted out, without thinking. My mother looked at me as if I had just blasphemed in front of the entire congregation. "What do you mean you don't want to? This is a call from God, girl. You can't refuse." "But I don't know how to teach catechism," I tried to reason. I barely know the commandments by heart. Father James said he will teach you everything, she insisted. It's an honor to be chosen. You'll start next Saturday, right after lunch. I didn't dare argue further. Her tone left no room for discussion. It was an order, not a request. And in our household, orders were to be obeyed, not questioned. I walked home feeling like I was marching to my own execution. How could I possibly be near Father James every week? How could I look at him without remembering that day? How could I bear it if he tried to heal something else in me? The week flew by, and Saturday arrived all too soon. I dressed in my best clothes, a simple pink dress, faded from many washings but at least without patches. I brushed my hair carefully, pulling it back in a low ponytail. My mother even pinned a small white ribbon in my hair. "You need to look presentable when serving the Lord," she said, practically pushing me out the door. I walked to the church with a heavy heart. What awaited me that afternoon? What did the priest really want with me? Why had he chosen me among all the young people in the parish? Questions hammered in my mind without answers. When I arrived, I saw other young people there, 6 girls and 4 boys, all between 14 and 16 years old. I recognized some from school, others only by sight. They were all seated in a semicircle in the parish hall beside the church, with Father James in the center. He smiled when he saw me enter. "Welcome, Margaret. We've been waiting for you." I sat in the only empty chair, as far away from him as possible. The priest began explaining how our work would be organized. Each of us would help with a group of children aged 7 to 10, preparing them for First Communion. We would teach them prayers, Bible stories, the commandments. Nothing that seemed strange or dangerous. "You have been chosen because you have special gifts," he said, looking at each of us in turn. But when his eyes landed on me, I felt there was something different in his gaze, something that wasn't there when he looked at the others. Or was it just my imagination? After the explanations, he divided the young people into pairs to practice how they would teach the lessons. By some miracle, I was paired with Susan, a girl I knew from school. I breathed a sigh of relief. At least I wouldn't be alone with him. But at the end of the meeting, when everyone was leaving, he called out to me, "Margaret, could you stay a moment? I need to speak with you privately." I froze. Susan looked at me curiously, but left with the others. I stood there in the middle of the hall, like a condemned prisoner awaiting sentence. The priest waited until everyone had gone and closed the door. He walked toward me with a smile that was meant to be kind but sent shivers down my spine. "How is your back?" he asked, coming closer than necessary. "Much better, Father. Thank you," I replied, taking a step backward. "Thanks be to God," he said, raising his hand as if to touch my shoulder. I instinctively backed away. He noticed, and his smile faltered for a moment. "You don't need to be afraid of me, Margaret. I only want to help." "I know, Father," I lied, unable to meet his eyes. "You're special," he continued. "God showed me that. You have a gift that few people possess." "What gift?" I asked, confused. "The gift of healing," he answered. "You could help many people, you know, just as I helped you." I didn't understand what he meant. How could I have the gift of healing? What did that even mean? "I don't understand, Father," I admitted. "I can teach you," he said, taking another step toward me. "I'll show you how to channel divine energy through your hands, but it needs to be done in private. It's sacred knowledge, not for just anyone." It was at that moment that something inside me broke. A voice in my head screamed, "No!" So loudly I almost thought I had said it out loud, but I hadn't. I just stood there, paralyzed, not knowing what to do. He must have sensed my hesitation because he changed tactics. "Think of all the people you could help. Your mother with her arthritis, your father who comes home from the factory with those terrible headaches, your little brother when he gets those asthma attacks. Wouldn't you want to help them?" That struck a chord. Of course I wanted to help my family. I wanted my mother to stop wincing every time she knelt to scrub the floors. I wanted my father not to come home so exhausted and irritable. I wanted my brother to be able to play outside without struggling to breathe. But something about the proposal didn't feel right. Why did it have to be in private? Why wasn't he teaching this to everyone? Why only me? "Can I think about it, Father?" I asked, finally finding my voice. He seemed surprised, as if he hadn't expected any resistance. His face changed for a brief moment. I saw something like anger or frustration flash across his eyes, but it was so quick I thought I might have imagined it. Soon, the kind smile was back. "Of course, my child. Think, pray, ask God for guidance, but don't take too long. There are many suffering people you could help." "May I go now?" I asked, desperate to leave. "Yes," he replied, stepping back slightly. "I'll see you next week." I left the hall almost running. The sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. I breathed in the evening air deeply, feeling as if I had just escaped a trap. I had no idea what to do. If I told my mother, she wouldn't believe me. On the contrary, she would force me to follow the priest's directions, whatever they might be. If I refused to return to the youth group, I would have to give explanations I wasn't prepared to give. It was that night, lying in bed listening to my sister's steady breathing, that I made the most important decision of my young life. A decision that, for a girl raised to obey without question, was almost unthinkable. I decided I would not return to that group. I would never be alone with Father James again. I would find a way, any way, to escape from that situation, even if it meant lying, disobeying, or even running away. Yes, running away. For the first time, the idea of leaving my home, my family, everything I knew, crossed my mind. It was terrifying, of course, but even more terrifying was the thought of staying and facing whatever the priest had in mind for me. The next morning, I woke up determined. The first step was to find an excuse not to attend the youth group next Saturday. After that, I needed to think of a bigger plan. I didn't know how or where I would go, but I knew I needed to get out of that town, and fast. What I didn't know was that fate had other plans for me. Plans that would change everything in a way I could never have imagined. That week, I kept thinking about how to avoid Saturday's meeting. I needed an excuse my mother would believe, something that would outweigh what she perceived as God's will behind Father James's invitation. On Thursday, the answer fell from heaven, literally. I began feeling a sharp pain in my throat. By the next day, I woke up with a high fever. This wasn't pretend, I swear to God. I actually got sick, with the kind of flu that knocks you flat on your back. My mother worried, called Dr. Patterson, who came to our house with his black bag full of mysterious instruments. "The girl has a temperature of 103, he declared. "She needs complete bed rest for at least a week." It was my first relief in weeks. Ironically, illness brought me peace. I knew I wouldn't have to face Father James that Saturday. My mother, despite her religious devotion, wasn't crazy enough to send me to church burning with fever. The flu lasted almost 2 weeks. When I finally recovered, my mother informed me that Father James had asked about me several times. "He even came by the house one day when you were sleeping," she told me, proud of the priest's attention. "He was so concerned, prayed by your bedroom door and everything." The idea of him entering our house, approaching me while I slept feverishly, made me feel nauseated. "What did he say?" I asked, trying to hide my fear. "He said that as soon as you're better, you should return to the group, that your place is being saved," she replied, smoothing my hair affectionately. "He thinks it's very important for you to develop your gift." So he had told my mother about this supposed gift I had. This complicated things. How could I explain to her that I didn't want to go back? How could I tell her I was afraid of the man who, in her eyes, was practically a saint? That's when I had an idea. "Mom," I said, trying to sound casual, "do you think Bobby Miller still wants to take me to the spring dance?" Bobby Miller was the son of the hardware store owner. He was 18, 4 years older than me, and had shown interest in dating me, or rather, he'd approached my father about it. This had happened a few months earlier, but my father had said I was still too young. Truthfully, I didn't even like Bobby. I thought he was a bit of a show-off with his letter jacket and the way he revved his Chevy's engine whenever he drove past groups of girls. But at that moment, he seemed like my lifeline. My mother looked at me in surprise. "Why are you asking about that now?" "I've just been thinking while I was sick," I lied. "I think maybe I'm old enough to start dating. Many girls my age already have steady boyfriends." My mother smiled, one of those rare smiles that lit up her tired face. "So you like him? I always thought you weren't interested." "I think I might," I lied again, feeling increasingly awful. "And his family is well off, you know? It would be good for all of us." That was true. The Millers weren't wealthy, but they owned the only hardware store in town, had a nice 2-story house on Maple Street with a picket fence and everything. By our standards, they were practically rich. A relationship between me and Bobby would benefit my family, lightening the burden of one less mouth to feed eventually. "I'll talk to your father," my mother said, still smiling. "I think he'll like the idea. Bobby's a hard worker, has a good future ahead of him." And so, with a desperate lie, I began charting my new course. A path that would take me away from Father James, from the church, from his hands and his gift of healing. I preferred to date someone I barely knew, someone I didn't love, than remain at the mercy of that man. My father, as expected, enthusiastically accepted the idea. The following weekend, Bobby came to dinner at our house. He was nervous, adjusting his belt constantly, running his hand through his hair slicked back with Brill cream. He brought gifts, a box of chocolates for my parents, a luxury rarely seen on our table, and a small bottle of Evening in Paris perfume for me. I played my part, smiled shyly, thanked him for the gift, served coffee after dinner in our best china, which only came out for special occasions. The courtship was arranged right there. We would start going steady, with the understanding that engagement would follow in a few months, once I turned 15. The wedding would be small, like all weddings in our town, but there was still much to prepare. News spread quickly through our small community. The following Sunday, after Mass, which I was forced to attend, now as Bobby's official girlfriend, several people came to congratulate us. Father James was among them. "So young Margaret is going to be married?" he asked, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So soon." "She's of age, Father," my father replied proudly. "And Bobby is a fine young man from a respectable family." "No doubt," the priest agreed, but his eyes were fixed on me, not on my father. "But what about her work with catechism? Margaret has a calling to serve the church." My mother answered for me, to my great relief. "Once she's married, Father, she'll have many responsibilities. Home, husband, children will come soon enough. God's plan, you know." I saw a shadow cross the priest's face. For a moment it seemed like he would protest, but then his gaze met mine, and something in what he saw there, perhaps my newfound determination, made him back off. "May God's will be done," he finally said, making the sign of the cross over us. "I will pray for you." In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into wedding preparations. My mother and aunts taught me how to sew sheets, tablecloths, nightgowns. I learned recipes, how to remove stains, how to make soap from scratch. In a way, it was a time of learning not just household tasks, but who I was and what I was capable of. The timid, frightened girl who blamed herself for innocent thoughts began to give way to a stronger, more determined young woman. Not that I suddenly became brave. No, the fear remained. But now I knew I could do something about it, that I didn't have to accept everything with a bowed head. I continued going to Mass, of course. It was mandatory, but always accompanied by family or by Bobby. I never again found myself alone near the priest. When he asked about my gift, I said I had prayed and hadn't felt the calling he mentioned. He didn't insist, at least not openly, but whenever he saw me in church, I could feel his gaze following me. The most surprising thing was that, over time, I began to feel something like affection for Bobby. It wasn't love, it wasn't passion. Those I would only come to know many years later. But he was kind to me, respectful. He brought me small gifts when he came to visit. A hair ribbon, butterscotch candies, once even a small bottle of drugstore perfume that he must have saved weeks to buy. He never tried to kiss me before our wedding, not even hold my hand when we were alone. This was rare in those days, even among very religious people. Later I discovered he was as nervous about the arrangement as I was. His father had pushed for the marriage, seeing a good opportunity to have a young, healthy daughter-in-law who could give him many grandchildren. Bobby had agreed because, well, in those days, sons obeyed their fathers without question. 3 months passed quickly. Soon the big day arrived. I was married on a Saturday morning, wearing a simple white dress that my mother had sewn. It wasn't the luxurious gown I had dreamed of as a child, but it was clean and well made, with delicate lace on the neckline that my grandmother had saved for years for this moment. The ceremony was in the same church where everything had happened, and it was Father James who performed the wedding. There was no other priest in town. Throughout the ceremony, I avoided looking directly at him. I concentrated on Bobby's nervous, sweating face, on the simple flowers on the altar, on the large crucifix hanging above us. When he said, "You may kiss the bride," I felt a shiver run down my spine. Bobby's kiss was quick, a shy peck that barely touched my lips. It was my first kiss ever. I felt nothing, neither disgust nor pleasure, just relief at officially being under the protection of another man who wasn't my father, out of the priest's reach. The reception was at Bobby's parents' backyard. They had a pig roast, homemade potato salad, fresh cornbread. There was even a small cake, a luxury for us. I danced with my father, with my new husband, with my uncles. The older women gave me advice about the wedding night, whispering things in my ear that made me blush. "It will hurt at first, but then it gets better," my aunt said. "Close your eyes and think of Jesus," suggested another. "It's your duty as a wife," reminded a third. No one talked about pleasure, about tenderness, about desire. These words weren't part of the vocabulary of the women in my family, my town, my era. You know, as I tell this part of my story, I'm thinking about you listening now. Perhaps you too have faced situations where you had to make difficult decisions to protect yourself. Or maybe you know someone going through something like this. Sometimes we feel so alone in our battles, don't we? I'd really love to know what you're feeling. If you'd like to share, leave in the comments. I understand this pain because I've experienced. It doesn't have to be much, just a word is enough. Your comment might be the embrace someone needs right now. There are so many people watching in silence, thinking they're the only ones suffering this way. When you share even a tiny piece of your story, you show others they're not alone. It's like extending your hand to someone in the dark. And as I continue my story, know that I'm here, listening to you with an open heart. The months following my wedding brought a mix of emotions I never expected. On one hand, I felt genuine relief at having escaped Father James's reach. On the other, I was now a wife at barely 15, living in a small apartment above my in-laws' garage, with all the responsibilities that entailed. Bobby was kind, if somewhat distant. He worked long hours at his father's hardware store, leaving early and returning late. When he was home, we existed in a sort of awkward companionship, like two people who had been assigned to share a space rather than a married couple. He never forced himself on me, something I was immensely grateful for. Our physical relationship was infrequent and mechanical, a duty rather than a pleasure for either of us. I settled into the routine of a young housewife, cooking, cleaning, learning to manage a household budget. I dropped out of school, as most girls in my position did. My mother-in-law, Sarah, taught me how to can vegetables from their garden, how to make bread that didn't turn out like bricks, how to stretch a dollar until it screamed. She wasn't unkind, just practical and somewhat distant, like her son. My weekly church attendance continued, but now I sat with the married women, wearing the gold band that marked my new status. Father James nodded cordially when he saw me, but made no special effort to engage me. I began to think perhaps I had imagined the whole thing, that maybe he had genuinely been trying to help me that day in the sacristy. But then I would catch him watching me during communion, and the feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. Life continued this way for almost a year. I was nearly 16 when I discovered I was pregnant. The doctor confirmed what my missed periods and morning sickness had suggested. Bobby seemed pleased in his quiet way. His parents were overjoyed, especially his father, who had been dropping hints about grandchildren since our wedding day. My pregnancy was difficult. I was young, my body not fully matured. Morning sickness plagued me well into the 5th month. Dr. Patterson put me on bed rest for the final weeks. It was during this period of enforced stillness that I had time to think, really think, about my life, my choices, and what I wanted for my child. I realized I didn't want my child to grow up with the same fears and confusion I had experienced. I didn't want them to believe their natural thoughts and feelings were sinful. I didn't want them to be afraid of their own body. And most importantly, I didn't want them to blindly trust authority figures simply because of their position. When Emily was born in the summer of 1976, something shifted inside me. Holding that tiny, perfect being in my arms, feeling her complete dependence on me, awakened a fierce protectiveness I never knew I possessed. I made silent promises to her as she slept in my arms, promises about honesty, about respect, about protection, promises I intended to keep no matter what. The first challenge to these promises came when Emily was 3 months old. My mother-in-law announced it was time to schedule Emily's baptism. "We'll need to talk to Father James," she said matter-of-factly over Sunday dinner. "He's baptized every Miller for 3 generations." "No," I said before I could stop myself. The table went silent. My father-in-law's fork paused midway to his mouth. Bobby looked up from his plate, startled. My mother-in-law's eyebrows shot up nearly to her hairline. "What do you mean, no?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. I hadn't planned this confrontation, had no strategy prepared. But I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that I did not want Father James's hands touching my daughter. "I mean," I said, struggling to sound reasonable, "I'd prefer to have her baptized at St. Mary's in Ridgefield." St. Mary's was a bigger church in the neighboring town, about 30 minutes away. "Why on earth would we do that?" my father-in-law demanded. "St. Anthony's has been our family church since before I was born." I looked to Bobby, hoping for support, but he seemed as confused as his parents. I needed a reason they would accept, something that wouldn't reveal my real concerns. "I made a promise," I said finally. "When I was having such a difficult pregnancy, I prayed to Our Lady of Lourdes. I promised if the baby was born healthy, I'd have her baptized in a church named after the Blessed Mother. It was a complete fabrication, of course, but invoking a sacred promise made during a difficult pregnancy was something they couldn't easily dismiss. Religious people understand vows made in desperate moments. My mother-in-law's face softened slightly. "You never mentioned this before." "It was private," I said, lowering my eyes. "Between me and the Blessed Mother." After some discussion and mild protest, they eventually agreed. Emily was baptized at St. Mary's by an elderly priest I'd never met before and hopefully would never see again. I felt no guilt about the lie. The relief of keeping Father James away from my daughter was worth whatever penance might come. As Emily grew, my protective instincts only strengthened. I made decisions that raised eyebrows in our conservative community. I answered her questions about her body honestly and without shame. When she was 4 and asked where babies came from, I gave her a simplified but accurate explanation, not the stork story other mothers told. When she started Sunday school at 5, I made sure to review what she was taught, gently correcting any messages of shame or fear. "God made your body," I told her. "He doesn't make mistakes, and He doesn't create things to trick or test us. Your body and your feelings are natural and good." These weren't revolutionary ideas in the wider world, perhaps, but in our small town in the late 1970s, they were uncommon enough to make me something of an oddity among the young mothers. I didn't care. Every time I saw Emily running freely, laughing without shame, asking questions without fear, I knew I was breaking an important cycle. Bobby didn't interfere with my parenting choices, though he sometimes seemed puzzled by them. "You're turning her into a little hippie," he joked once, when Emily came home from kindergarten and announced she'd refused to say that Eve was bad for eating the apple. But there was no real criticism in his voice. Our marriage had evolved into a comfortable partnership, if not a passionate one. We were friends, co-parents, companions. There was respect between us, and a kind of love, though not the romantic kind I would later come to know was possible. I was grateful for the safety and stability he provided, and I think he appreciated the calm, organized home I maintained. When Emily was 6, something happened that validated all my protective instincts. We were at Sunday Mass, still obligatory in our household, though I'd managed to reduce our attendance to twice a month rather than weekly. Father James announced that there would be special catechism classes for children after the service. Emily, curious like all children, wanted to stay. "No," I said firmly, taking her hand. "But Mom, all my friends are staying," she protested. "We have to get home for lunch," I said, manufacturing an excuse. "Grandma's expecting us." In the car on the way home, with Emily sulking in the back seat, Bobby finally asked the question I'd been dreading for years. "Margaret, what do you have against Father James?" The question caught me off guard. After 7 years of marriage, it was the first time he'd directly addressed my obvious aversion to the priest. I remained silent for a moment, considering how to respond. Bobby was a good man, a good husband, a good father. Did he deserve the truth? Or at least part of it? "When I was 14, I began, choosing my words carefully. Father James called me into the sacristy after confession. He said he was going to heal my back pain through prayer. He touched me in a way that made me uncomfortable." Bobby pulled the car over abruptly. He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of shock and something else. Anger, perhaps? Did he molest you?" he asked directly. That was the question I had been asking myself for years. Had it been abuse, or had it been healing, as the priest claimed? The priest's hands on my back had indeed relieved my pain, but they had also awakened confusing, shameful feelings, had left me with doubts that persisted to this day. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "He touched my back where it hurt. The pain went away. But the way he did it, it left me confused, frightened. I don't know if it was abuse or not. I just know I don't want our daughter alone with him." Bobby was quiet for a long time. Then, without another word, he put the car back in drive and continued toward home. I thought he was angry, that he didn't believe me, that he was going to accuse me of making things up. But when we arrived home and Emily ran inside to see her grandparents, he asked me to stay in the car for a moment. "I believe you," he said simply, "and will never set foot in that church again as long as that man is there." It was one of the most surprising and moving moments of my life. To be believed, to be taken seriously, to have my experience validated, this was something I had never expected. Tears came unbidden. Bobby reached across the seat and took my hand, an awkward but sincere gesture of support. We rarely touched outside of the bedroom, so the simple contact meant more than any elaborate embrace could have. "Thank you," I whispered. "No need to thank me," he replied. "It's the least I can do." From that day forward, our lives changed. We began attending a different church in another town, which meant we only went to Mass once a month due to the distance. Bobby, who had previously been somewhat detached from Emily's upbringing, became more involved, more attentive. It was as if my revelation of vulnerability had awakened a protective instinct in him that he hadn't known he possessed. Our daughter grew up differently than I had, with less formal religion and more love and respect. I taught her to question, to think for herself, to respect her body and the bodies of others. It wasn't a typical upbringing for that time and place, but it was the best I could offer, based on the wounds of my own past. The years passed, and our family grew. After Emily came Thomas, born when I was 20. Unlike my first pregnancy, this one was easier, smoother. Perhaps because I was older, or perhaps because I carried less fear and confusion inside me. Either way, Thomas arrived healthy and strong, with Bobby's nose and my stubborn chin. We raised our children with principles that seemed radical in our conservative community. We taught them that questions were welcome, that their bodies were their own, that because I said so was never a sufficient reason for anything. When Emily had her first period at 12, I sat with her and explained everything. Not just the biological facts, but the emotional aspects too. I made sure she knew it wasn't shameful, wasn't a punishment, wasn't a curse of Eve, as my mother had taught me. It was simply part of growing up. Bobby supported my parenting approach, though he didn't always understand it. "You're raising them different than anybody else around here," he would say sometimes, watching Emily argue passionately about something she'd read, or Thomas question why boys couldn't cry when they were hurt. But there was no criticism in his voice. If anything, there was a hint of pride. Our marriage evolved over time into a deeper partnership. We never had the passionate romance depicted in movies, but we developed a steady, reliable affection. Bobby was a good provider, a responsible father, a decent man who tried his best. I respected him for that and, in my own way, loved him. We built a comfortable life together, eventually moving out of the apartment, above his parents' garage, into a small but nice house of our own on the other side of town. As for church, we attended irregularly, always at St. Mary's in Ridgefield, never at St. Anthony's. The children were raised with religious instruction, but it was tempered with critical thinking. "Listen to what the priest says," I would tell them. "But remember that priests are people too. They can make mistakes. Always ask questions, even if only in your mind." The years slipped by, marked by milestones big and small. Emily's first day of kindergarten, Thomas learning to ride a bike, family vacations to the lake each summer, Christmas mornings around our modest tree. Through it all, I carried the memory of that day in the sacristy, not as an open wound anymore, but as a scar that occasionally pulled tight when the weather changed. The first real breakthrough in my understanding came when Emily was 17. She had been accepted to Ohio State University, the first in either of our families to go to college. The night after her high school graduation, as we sat on the porch swing watching fireflies rise from the lawn, she handed me a book. "I thought you might find this interesting, Mom," she said. It was a psychology textbook she'd borrowed from her guidance counselor. There's a chapter on something called religious trauma syndrome. Made me think of some of the stories you've told about growing up. Later that night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table reading the chapter she had marked. It described patterns of emotional and psychological damage caused by rigid religious upbringings, the fear, the shame, the confusion, the difficulty trusting one's own perceptions. It was like reading about myself, about my childhood, about the perfect conditions that had been created for what happened to me. But there was one paragraph that struck me like a lightning bolt. In cases of abuse within religious contexts, victims often experience profound confusion about what occurred. This is especially true when the abuse is couched in terms of healing or spiritual guidance. The authority figure may genuinely believe they are helping, may be self-deluded about their intentions, or may be deliberately exploiting the situation. For the victim, this ambiguity can be more psychologically damaging than clear-cut abuse, as it prevents them from fully processing the experience. I read those words over and over. It was the first time I had encountered an explanation that made sense of my decades-long uncertainty. Maybe it didn't matter whether Father James thought he was healing me or not. Maybe the impact on me, the confusion, the shame, the doubt, was the real issue, regardless of his intentions. Over the next few years, I read more on the subject. Books about trauma, about religious abuse, about the exploitation of spiritual authority. Each one helped me fit another piece into the puzzle of my experience. Emily went off to college, then Thomas followed 3 years later. With the children gone, Bobby and I found ourselves alone together for the first time since our awkward early marriage. Surprisingly, we discovered we still had things to talk about, interests to share. We took up bowling on Tuesday nights, joined a couple's card game at the community center on Fridays. It wasn't excitement, but it was companionship, and after so many years together, that counted for something. It was during this period, in my early 40s, that I began to feel a growing need to confront what had happened to me more directly. Not by confronting Father James, he was still at St. Anthony's, though much older now, but by better understanding my own experience. I found a therapist in Ridgefield, a woman named Dr. Helen Carter, who specialized in trauma. It took tremendous courage to make that first appointment. In our small community, seeing a head doctor was still viewed with suspicion, but something inside me knew it was time. In that small, comfortable office with its blue walls and potted plants, I told my full story for the first time. Not the abbreviated version I had shared with Bobby, or the hints I had occasionally dropped to Emily. The complete story, with all the details I could remember, the sacristy, the hands on my back, the confusing sensations, the real healing of my pain, the years of doubt and uncertainty. Dr. Carter listened without judgment. When I finished, she asked questions that helped me explore aspects of the experience I had never considered. Had Father James isolated other young people? Had there been rumors about him? Had other girls suddenly stopped attending church activities? As I reflected on these questions, memories surfaced that I hadn't connected before. Susan, a girl a year older than me who had abruptly stopped attending youth group around the same time I was avoiding it. Rumors about a woman in her 20s who had gone to the bishop with some complaint about Father James, only to be sent back to her parish with instructions to pray more. The way certain mothers seemed to never leave their daughters alone at church functions. These patterns are unfortunately common, Dr. Carter explained. Predators, whether they recognize themselves as such or not, often choose positions that give them authority and access to vulnerable people. The church has been particularly problematic because of the additional layer of spiritual authority. But the pain in my back really did go away, I said, still caught in my old confusion. If he abused me, how could he also heal me? Dr. Carter's response was thoughtful. The human body responds to touch in complex ways. The relaxation of chronic tension through touch is well documented. Additionally, the power of suggestion, especially from someone you viewed as divinely appointed, could absolutely impact your pain perception. These physiological responses don't negate the inappropriateness of his actions. Over months of therapy, I began to understand that what had happened was indeed a violation. A man in a position of power had used that power to touch a young girl in ways that confused and frightened her, all under the guise of spiritual healing. Whether he had conscious predatory intentions or was deluded about his own motivations didn't change the impact on me. This clarity brought both pain and relief. Pain at finally acknowledging the wrongness of what had happened. Relief at no longer carrying the burden of uncertainty. I began to forgive myself for not speaking up, for running away into marriage, for the years of confusion. I came to understand that my response had been entirely normal for a child in that situation. My relationship with Bobby deepened as I shared more of my healing journey with him. He never pushed for details, never questioned the validity of my experience. He simply offered steady support, driving me to therapy appointments, making sure I had space and time to process what was emerging. In his quiet, steadfast way, he became my strongest ally. The most profound change, however, came in how I viewed my own life choices. What I had once seen as running away, my early marriage, my break with the church, I now recognized as remarkable courage. At 14, with no support, no language for what had happened, I had still found a way to protect myself. I had broken free from the control of a man who might have continued to exploit me. I had constructed a life that, while imperfect, had allowed me to raise children free from the damage that had been done to me. By my mid-40s, I had come to a place of genuine peace with my experience. Not forgiveness for Father James. I never reached that point, nor did I feel obligated to. But peace with my own story, with the ways I had survived and eventually thrived despite what had happened. It was around this time that I began to consider whether my experience might help others. Not through public accusations. Too much time had passed, and the legal system offered little recourse. But perhaps through sharing what I had learned, through breaking the silence that protected men like Father James. The opportunity came when Dr. Carter asked if I would be willing to join a support group she was forming for women who had experienced religious trauma. Your perspective could be invaluable, she said, especially for the younger women who are still in the early stages of processing their experiences. That first support group meeting changed the course of the rest of my life. Sitting in a circle with 7 other women, ranging in age from 20 to 70, I shared my story again. As I spoke, I saw recognition dawn in their eyes, the same confusion, the same self-doubt, the same struggle to reconcile spiritual authority with personal violation. When I finished, a young woman named Rachel was crying openly. "That's exactly how I feel," she said. "Like I don't know whether what happened was wrong or if I'm just misinterpreting everything." It was in that moment that I found a new purpose. If my story could help even one person avoid decades of uncertainty and self-blame, then perhaps there was meaning to be found in what I had endured. Today, at 64, I look back at a life that unfolded from that day in the sacristy. A day that lasted only minutes, but marked decades. A touch that confused a 14-year-old girl and set paths the adult woman would follow. I've often wondered how my life might have been different if that had never happened. Would I have married so young? Would I have married Bobby? Would I have had Emily and Thomas? Probably not. And as strange as it may sound, I can't imagine a life without them. This doesn't mean I'm grateful for what happened. I never will be. Abuse is always wrong, always harmful, never justified. But I am grateful for the woman I became despite it, for the strength I discovered within myself, for the people who entered my life as a result of the choices I made in response to that experience. I've learned over the years that life is rarely black and white, that painful experiences can generate growth, that trauma can be a source of wisdom, that wounds can transform into gifts, not because the trauma itself is good, but because our response to it can be extraordinary. When I think about Father James now, I feel neither hatred nor fear. I feel compassion, not for him, but for the girl I was, for the confusion I felt, the guilt I carried, the silence I maintained. And I feel gratitude for the woman I managed to become, despite all of that. My children are grown now, with families of their own. Emily has 2 teenage daughters, beautiful and confident, who know more about their bodies and their rights at 15 than I knew at 30. Thomas has a son and daughter still in elementary school, but he's already raising them with the same values of respect and self-knowledge that he learned from me. The most important legacy I'll leave isn't land or material possessions, but this heritage of breaking silence, of protection, of different education. A legacy that I hope will protect many future generations. I still work with support groups when I can. I'm not a psychologist or specialist, just a woman who has lived a long time and learned a few things along the way. But sometimes that's exactly what another person needs to hear. Sometimes simply saying, "I understand, I went through it too, you're not alone," makes all the difference. I never imagined that at 64 I would be sitting here telling this story. For many years, I thought I would take this secret to my grave. Silence seemed safer, more comfortable. But there is transformative power in breaking that silence, in naming what happened, in sharing with others who might be experiencing the same confusion, the same corrosive doubt. If you're listening to me now, and something in my story resonates with you, I want you to know a few things that took me decades to understand. First, it wasn't your fault. No matter what you felt, no matter if your body responded, no matter if you didn't scream or run away. Children don't have the capacity to consent with adults in positions of power. The responsibility is always always with the adult. Second, your doubts are normal. Religious abuse is especially confusing because it mixes the sacred with the profane, healing with violation, divine love with human exploitation. This confusion is part of the trauma, not a sign that you're exaggerating or imagining things. Third, healing is possible. It's not linear. It's not complete. It doesn't have a defined endpoint. It's a process, a journey full of ups and downs, but each step you take toward understanding, acceptance, self-love is a valuable step. Fourth, you're not alone. No matter how unique your case may seem, no matter how isolated you feel, there are other people who have experienced similar things and who are willing to listen, to welcome you, to believe you. Fifth, your story matters. Your testimony might be the light that guides someone else out of darkness. Your courage to speak might give someone else the courage to seek help. Your healing journey might inspire someone else to begin theirs. I know not everyone will be as fortunate as I was. Not everyone will find a Bobby who quietly believes and unconditionally supports. Not everyone will have an Emily who perceives without being told and offers liberating knowledge. Not everyone will meet a Rachel who shares similar experiences and offers deep understanding. But I want you to know that such people exist, that there are safe spaces, support groups, dedicated professionals who believe survivors, that you don't need to carry this burden alone, as I did for so long. One of the great lessons I've learned on this journey is about the power of time. Time doesn't heal all wounds, as they say. Some wounds are too deep to close completely. But time gives us perspective, gives us tools, gives us the chance to build a life larger than our wounds. Another important lesson is about the power of voice. When I finally began to speak about what had happened, first to my daughter, then to my husband, then to other survivors, each word spoken was like a weight lifted from my shoulders. Each time I named what had happened, the power that experience held over me diminished a little. I've also learned about the value of forgiveness, not of the abuser who never showed remorse, but of myself. For a long time, I blamed myself for not shouting, for not running away, for not telling someone, for feeling confused sensations in my body, for doubting my own experience. Forgiving myself for these perfectly natural and understandable reactions was one of the most difficult and most liberating steps in my journey. And perhaps most importantly, I've learned about the power of choice. I couldn't choose what happened to me in that sacristy, but I could choose how to live afterward. I could choose to break cycles, protect my children, seek help, offer help to others. I could choose to transform an experience of victimization into a story of survival and eventually triumph. I don't know how much time I have left in this world. Nobody does. But I know that when my time comes, I'll be able to look back and say, I did the best I could with the cards I was dealt. I transformed pain into purpose. I converted silence into voice. I changed not just my own story, but also that of the generations that will come after me. If there's a final message I'd like to leave, it's this. It's never too late to start your healing journey. It's never too late to break the silence. It's never too late to transform your story of pain into one of growth and meaning. My story doesn't have a perfect ending. There's no complete justice for what happened. Father James died without ever facing consequences for his actions. There's no total cure for deep traumas. I still have difficult days, painful memories, unexpected triggers. But there is peace. There is purpose. There is a rich and meaningful life built on the ruins of what was broken. And that, in the end, is a greater victory than any legal justice could provide. With each person who hears my story and finds in it an echo of their own experience, with each survivor who decides to seek help after hearing me, with each parent who decides to protect their children with more awareness, with each of these small impacts, the harm done to me is a little more transformed into good. It's not a happy ending in the traditional sense. It's something more complex, more realistic, more human. It's an ending that acknowledges the pain but isn't defined by it, an ending that honors the past but doesn't live in it, an ending that looks to the future with hope, not naivety. And perhaps that's the kind of ending that most resembles real life. Imperfect, unfinished, constantly evolving. An ending that isn't really an ending, but a point in an ongoing journey. A journey that, despite all its twists and obstacles, is worth living fully. And that was my story. Now I want to know, where are you listening from? Comment below and let me know what city you're from. A warm embrace to all of you.